Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Washington, D.C., FP's home base in the studio with our producer and editor, Claudia. In Berlin this week, where I usually am, we've switched spots, is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, as always, we prepared some material for you all, but as is also the case these days, there's a lot more happening in the world than we can keep up with. You know, and Adam and I are always talking about what we should be talking about, what we should be covering, but we also realize that when there's so much happening, whether it's tariffs being imposed by the Trump administration, a new crypto sovereign fund that's announced, the State of the Union address that also walked through a bunch of potential policies, and we realize that it's sometimes hard to tell what we should be preparing for, what we shouldn't be, what is a real policy, what is not a real policy. And that got us thinking we should perhaps start our episodes off by trying to just catch up with what's going on in the news at all before we shift then to some, more considered topics that we have prepared in advance on. And so we thought we'd start doing so this week, in fact, because some big news just happened in Europe. We're recording this on Wednesday morning, U.S. time. Last night, I saw the news that the incoming German government, so it's not yet in office, but the incoming German government has come to an agreement on government spending and specifically on taking on debt for the purposes of building the German military and also improving the country's infrastructure. This is a major change to a topic we've discussed in the past, the German debt brake, which puts spending in Germany by the government under pretty onerous constitutional rules. This looks like it could be the end of that era in German government spending, precipitated by the Trump administration, as so much is these days, and its threats to Europe and Ukraine specifically. Adam, to get a handle on this and just how momentous it is, because with all going on, I can't help but notice that U.S. newspapers are not even mentioning this news about what happened in Germany last night. European commentators seem to realize it's pretty momentous, but it hasn't really sunk in here. I wonder if we could just start off by just describing what the rules were before in Germany on government spending and what they seem to be now with this new announcement.
Yeah, this is really huge. It's huge because for years, for the best part of more than a decade, in fact, the central question has been when the leading economy, by many metrics, the most successful democracy in Europe, will wake up. And in so doing, change the circumstances of the German economy, but then also change potentially the conditions for everyone else in Europe. And were that to happen, Europe would constitute a block of population and economic weight easily commensurate with the United States, and it will be able to face the challenges that Europe particularly has written on its flags, climate change, which Europe has stuck to as a key issue, but of course right now the challenge of Russian aggression in Ukraine and the need to counter it. And the drama of this announcement is that basically within days of the outcome of the German election, which we covered on the show a couple of episodes back, that is, the build-up to the election was covered, the incoming German government has agreed that they need to spend, and they need to spend big. There used to be, it was a rule put in place in 2009, and it's still written into the constitution, a limit on federal government deficits, new borrowing of 0.35% of GDP. So that's tiny. Right now, the US deficit is 6% of GDP. So that's 18 times larger. Relative to GDP, and a near total ban on new borrowing by the components of the German Federation, which are the states. These are large entities, so North Rhine-Westphalia is bigger than Greece in terms of its economy. So these are big blocks of the German economy. They were barely able to borrow at all, so they operated under balanced budget rules. And over the period since 2009, this has led to a gradual squeezing, a suffocation of public investment in Germany. If you spend any time here, you realize it's really biting into the German capacity to function as a modern economy. I did a Chartbook newsletter about, the way in which it's currently impossible for the German railway system to move more than a brigade and a half. So that's like 7,000 men and equipment, heavy equipment of military personnel across the country at any one time. So Germany has kind of lost the capacity to function as a high-level, big modern state as a result of chronic underinvestment. And this was an issue that really plagued the previous government, which was, to remind people, this traffic light coalition of the Greens, the Reds, and the Liberals. It's traffic light because the political colour of the Liberals in Germany is yellow. So there you go. And that coalition was blocked by the fiscal conservatism of the Liberals. It was over that the coalition broke down and early elections were held. The elections were held on February 23rd, and they've resulted in new majorities for the German parties, specifically one anchored on the CDU, the Christian Democrats, the modern centrist Christian Democrats that have governed Germany for much of its history since the end of World War II. They scored just less than 30%, which was a disappointment, but puts them in the lead. The right-wing AfD scored just over 20%, which was a disappointment, but is a shock increase over where they were previously, because this is a party with a neo-Nazi fringe. So that was a shock. And it has a huge impact on German politics because everyone else in the political system under the so-called firewall principle, which Vance pilloried at the Munich Security Conference, has refused to do business with them. So that leaves you with 80% of the parliament to actually work with. And the Social Democrats, the classic social democratic socialist party of Europe, going all the way back to the 19th century, fell to a miserable 16%. And the Greens, likewise disappointing, and the Liberals, a former member of the government, out of the parliament altogether under the German 5% rule. So how do you form a new government, and what is its agenda going to be? It was pretty clear that it would need to break through the impasse of the previous government over investment. And it was clear that it had to do that because the previous government had come to grief, and because the pressure on Germany is mounting and is compounded by every action of the Trump administration, the Vance Munich speech, the horrendous press conference with Zelensky and Vance and Trump, now the announcements of the end of US aid of all kinds, including intelligence sharing with Ukraine this week, and no doubt more things to follow. And what's remarkable is that ahead of actually forming the new government, the new parliament won't come into effect for several weeks. The old parliament, with a new majority forming within it on the basis of the election, so in the lame duck period in between, is negotiating over a constitutional change for which you need a 2/3 majority that will release this constraint on German public spending that's been in place since 2009. German public spending overall is European level high. It's over 50% of GDP, but Germany's debt level is 60% of GDP, which is, on some measures, half America's debt to GDP ratio. So there is scope for investment, and everyone for years has been banging on the German doors saying, spend, invest. But in bond markets, the Germans don't even issue enough debt, and sometimes they pay negative interest rates as a result. And now the moment seems to have arrived, rather perversely, under the auspices of a conservative-led government with social democratic backing. And what they're proposing to do is it's kind of a fishy deal, right? So what they're proposing to do is loosen the debt brake constitutionally on defense spending. So basically to say that if defense spending is above 1% of GDP, and obviously the NATO goal used to be 2%, the Trump demand was as high as 5%. Most people estimate that Germany needs to go to 3 to 4% as sustainable defense spending to mount a credible alternative to Russia. Any spending above 1% is exempt from the debt brake. So essentially they're saying the debt brake applies only fractionally to defense spending. So for the rest, they want a free ride. How are you going to get that? Well, you're actually going to enroll the Greens, who, on the basis of their 2021 result, added to the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, an alliance that the Christian Democrats would never have agreed to when they were out of office. But now, prospectively, as they expect to take power, they're going to enroll the Greens without apparently having discussed this with them in an effort to get a 2/3 majority to change this debt brake rule, and agreeing with the Social Democrats on the priorities of the new government. The two of them have agreed that there will be a 500 billion euro, so that's roughly $500 billion, which against the German GDP of 4.5 trillion is a lot of money. In the US context, it wouldn't be that much, but in Germany, it's really substantial money. This is IRA money in an economy a fifth the size of the US. So really a substantial amount of money. That's going to be a special fund outside the budget altogether. right? So it's a combination of a principled shift on the debt brake on the constitutional terms, where you're going to strong arm the Greens on the basis of the lame duck Bundestag to pass the change, and a off-budget, off-balance sheet 500 billion euro fund for civilian infrastructure, green energy, all of that good stuff, the stuff that is so lagging in Germany of late. And why are you doing this, all these shenanigans, and why are you doing this so quickly? Because when the new Bundestag meets, as a result of the fragmentation of German public opinion over recent years, when that body convenes, the only way of getting to a two-thirds majority, given that the right, the Nazis, the neo-Nazi AfD, far right, has got 20% of the vote, is to assemble a coalition that includes the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and Die Linke, which is a true left-wing socialist party, elements of which descend from the post-socialist, SED regime in East Germany in the 1990s. And it includes the breakaway wing. So it's like the Bernie Sanders wing of German politics. And you would need to bring them into the tent to get this through, and they will most likely dig in their heels over defense spending. And that, for the Christian Democrats under Friedrich Merz, their quite right-wing lead candidate and future chancellor, would be a huge embarrassment. So what you're going to try and do is bounce the constitutional change through the old Bundestag, which the Christian Democrats sabotaged, strong-arming the Greens into agreeing, and avoid being at the mercy of the new Bundestag, the new distribution of power, and crucially, on the veto vote of Die Linke, so as to be able to move forward with high levels of defense spending. Die Linke won't oppose infrastructure spending, but Die Linke might very well say that it would resist a debt brake reform, a constitutional change specifically to enable higher defense spending. So this is, Germans play hardball politics too. This is the highest functioning democracy in the West by many standards. It's, exemplary in terms of the way in which the election is run. But when it comes to forming governments, it's a dirty business of dog eat dog in terms of assembling the coalitions necessary to govern.
Yeah, I was going to say, the ways that democratic legitimacy are implicated here, I think, are fascinating. It's not just that they held an election to create a new parliament. They're using the old parliament to pass these laws before the new parliament now can get in. Second of all, they just had a campaign. They just had a national campaign. And foreign policy issues, first of all, didn't really come up. In terms of the emphasis of the campaign, it was really much relegated to the background. Second of all, to the extent that questions about the debt brake came up, the winner of the election who's presiding over these now announcements was against all of the things he's now announcing. He spent weeks going around saying he would not do the thing he immediately did upon winning the election, which is, kind of head spinning in its own way. And it just gets you wondering about, the constitutional changes in general, whether they're ever democratic. Like, is this how change really happens? It just somehow happens without any public debate or any kind of, we just had set aside weeks to have public discourse and then something else happens entirely. It is a fascinating thing to watch in real time. But I guess I would also just ask the incoming chancellor who's presiding over this, Friedrich Merz. He's a conservative. He was against changing the debt brake, at least preemptively, during the campaign. I wonder, is this a kind of, Nixon goes to China moment? Like, if this is a momentous change for Germany and then for Europe and its military spending and its military autonomy, Friedrich Merz is someone who's rooted in transatlanticism, in Germany's inherited identity as a kind of as bound to the United States and to the West in general. And now he may be leading this kind of moment of autonomy for the continent. Did you need a kind of conservative transatlantic politician to initiate this change? Is that maybe what's going on here?
I think that logic, I think, is on the face of it really compelling. You could say that Angela Merkel did something similar during the COVID crisis. After all, Angela Merkel during the Eurozone crisis announced that only over her dead body would there ever be Euro bonds. She said, not in my lifetime. And then come the COVID crisis with the drama of the COVID crisis. And at that time, too, a Trump administration that was essentially in meltdown, Brussels with Berlin and Paris holding, the ring, went for very large-scale debt issuance as an emergency answer. So there is a tradition of this. But I think in Merz's case, there is an extra level of cynicism. I mean, this really is behavior reminiscent of the GOP, which, when it's in opposition, hard negotiates over the debt limits in the US. And then when Trump is in the White House, anything goes. In this case, if Merz had been a principled Atlanticist, after all, he could have said a year ago or 2 years ago to the Greens, the Social Democrats and the Liberals in government, look, I see your problem, Greens and Social Democrats. I know that it is the Liberals that are preventing you from acting. I understand that Germany needs an active defense and investment policy in the face of the probability, after all, that America is unreliable and just the threat posed by Putin. Here are the votes you need to pass this constitutional change, which I know if I ever were to become chancellor, I would need. So if he really were a far-sighted Atlanticist figure, rather than, I think, in some ways, a rather superficial, impulsive politician with a bunch of gut instincts and then a kind of managerialism that kicks in, I think you would have asked the CDU to make this move at an earlier stage. And I've always thought that, I ventured this hypothesis last year that the progressive coalition, the only viable governing coalition in Germany, is in fact one that consists of the CDU, the SPD, and the Greens, because the Liberals aren't available for that coalition. And hey presto, even though that isn't the complexion of the parliament to come, in the last remaining window in which you can make that arithmetic add up, what are they doing? They're changing the constitution to enable the new government. And it is an open question whether the Greens will go along with this. This is not a done deal, right? There is no actual coalition paper between the SPD and the CDU. And the way this works in Germany is they will draft a contract point by point and actually then try and implement it with their Bundestag majority. So they're a long way away from that. Within the CDU, there's already opposition to the deal that Merz has done. The young CDU, the right-wing left, youth movement of the Christian Democrats hates what they've agreed because it's a sellout, as you say. It's a flip-flop. It's a massive flip-flop. It's very unclear whether the Greens will succumb to this. I heard talk in Berlin over the weekend that it was just inconceivable that they would do it. It's too transparent. It's like too obvious. Essentially, they're being exploited by the CDU, which helped to wreck their government. If the FDP with a hammer, the CDU with the anvil that destroyed the last government. And it's quite obvious that they're basically just trying to avoid a democratic confrontation with the new Bundestag in which the Linke has a voice. And so it's not a done deal, and it's not a done deal at the federal level, because in Germany, a constitutional change would need to go past the Bundestag, and then it would need to go past the federal chamber, the Bundesrat. And in that, if the Liberals don't play ball, where they're still represented, they don't have the 2/3 majority there that they would need. So there's a lot of water still to go under this bridge. Earliest moment, I think this could probably really come into effect will be April or May. And between times, there will be quite a lot of haggling. I mean, on the one hand, you could say on a strict interpretation of democratic legitimacy, you could say it's a bankruptcy. And on the other hand, you could say, whoa, this is an imaginative use of the rules, right? If you really want to make things go. And after all, the Trump administration, literally hour by hour, gives us new reason to question the prevailing status quo and to search for new solutions. This is creative politics. This is what it could look like. But it has a cynical aspect, I can't deny. And I was persuaded over the weekend by folks close to power in Berlin that this wasn't going to work, that they weren't going to be able to get this through because it's just too transparent.
Yeah, momentous times. It seems like unexpected things happen. I mean, again, and this is being justified, Merz has said, because Europe needs to be able to defend itself. In other words, may not be able to rely on the United States. And so we'll see whether Germany under his leadership is willing to allow other European countries to jointly borrow money to spend on their militaries. We'll see what they do on the European level. There's a lot of questions that remain to be answered, but it is a momentous shift in the name of European autonomy. And what's clear is that the taps are on in Germany, at least to some extent, if this all gets through. What is also clear, to shift to the topic that we had prepared ahead of time, is that the taps have been on in the United States for a very long time. The data point we have there is $1.8 trillion. That is the U.S. budget deficit in 2024 that is added to the overall U.S. debt, which is some $36 trillion. As I mentioned, there's so much going on in the United States these days, but in the background is this looming U.S. debt that some people in the financial world are beginning to suggest may not be sustainable, that the United States could buckle under this debt and, go broke is the euphemism. I guess that would be used at some point. Yeah, so we thought we would take a look at this, given that the Trump administration is, to the extent it has a legislative platform, is trying to add to that debt, is trying to add to that budget deficit by making current tax cuts permanent and increasing military spending and spending on immigration enforcement, etc. So with that looming increase in the deficit, we thought we'd take a closer look at what exactly the future of it is. Adam, to start off with, obviously there is supply and demand for U.S. debt. The U.S. government is producing it. There is demand for that U.S. debt out there, but I'm curious where the demand exactly comes from. I mean, it seems like there are private investors who clearly are interested in holding U.S. debt and buying it, and then there are also kind of public institutions that buy that U.S. debt. And I'm curious if we should keep a distinction there in mind. I mean, does it make a difference whether it's central banks that are, purchasing U.S. debt? Is the growth of kind of those public institutions buying U.S. debt a sign of instability in some way?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating set of issues. And the short answer is yes, it does make a difference whether or not the debt is held publicly or privately or inside or outside the United States. And just to give our listeners an idea, foreign holding of US government debt is in the order of $9 trillion, so about a quarter of the debt that you mentioned, Cam, a minute ago. Chinese holdings, rather, one of the more notorious elements of foreign holding of US debt, are down over time since the early 2010s from $1.3 trillion to closer to $760 billion at this point. And there is a continuous unwinding of Chinese public holding of US debt. We can talk more about the logic of that. That leaves Japan and investors in the UK as leading holders of US debt. Why this matters is that public holders of debt are less price sensitive. So if you're a reserve manager for a foreign central bank, you just have a target to invest a certain share of your foreign exchange accumulation in safe foreign assets, and the US Treasury market is the safe place to do that. And you don't look as to the rate of return, the yield, or the relative rate of yield that much, because it's a mechanical operation. And so those kind of investors are particularly attractive to the issuers of debt on the American side. But they are, in a sense, more political, and they are of a rather different nature than what we might imagine debt markets to be when you take government debt and sell it to private investors of different types. And those come in different shapes and sizes. They could be insurance funds or pension funds or American banks, which help manage the US Treasury market, but they could also be hedge funds who are speculators that use the giant US Treasury market as, if you like, the sort of home base, the revolving market around which they organize very large-scale speculative bets. So we can broadly distinguish between foreign official, private holders domestically within the United States and highly leveraged speculative investors. And each one of those comes with a particular profile and a risk and return from the US point of view. And so there's a committee that actually advises the US Treasury, made up of leading figures in Wall Street, both American and outside, that help manage the Treasury market. And they issue reports of their deliberations, generally with a 12-month lag. And I thought I'd just read out the minutes of a meeting at the end of 2024 that were used to describe what had gone on in the market. It's quite fascinating to hear. Dealers observed moderate foreign official demand for treasuries in 2024, but more robust foreign private demand. Dealers pointed to changes in trade patterns, cross-currency hedging costs, geopolitical tensions, and the strengthening of the US dollar as potential headwinds to foreign official demand. So foreign official investors are sensitive to prices and to incentives, but not acutely in short-run terms. They follow the trends over the course of a year. By contrast, dealers observed healthy foreign private demand from levered investors located in the UK, Euro area, and the Cayman Islands. And levered foreign private investors located in the Cayman Islands is just code for hedge funds, right? Because that's where they're located. These more price-sensitive investors were reportedly motivated by basis trading opportunities and attractive yield differentials. That's technical jargon for various types of speculative trade that the hedge funds will put on. Dealers expected these trends to continue over the next year. So what we see is a US debt management financial bureaucracy that is closely tied into Wall Street dealers. These are banks which buy and sell treasuries and watch the flows on each side, anxiously monitoring the world and dividing that world into official foreign investors, domestic investors implicitly, and foreign private investors, and mapping the world in those terms. And so, yes, there is considerable anxiety about this. And the real nightmare is that you could have a sort of chain reaction in which nervousness on the part of reserve managers triggers hedge fund selling, which then destabilizes the investments of American households and American pension and insurance funds.
Yeah, and I guess at the foundation of all this is the question of whether the U.S. debts are sustainable and whether these private investors or public official investors are, they have different interests. Are they better or worse than each other in assessing whether the debts are sustainable? And I'm curious how they go about that. I mean, the question is whether the debts can in fact sustainably be paid back. And when obviously the U.S. debts are rising, and they're rising in fact even relative to incomes in the United States, and the debts end up getting rolled over at the end of the year because they're not all paid back, and so interest gets accumulated, et cetera. I mean, how are these investors thinking about whether the debts can be paid back fully or sustainably in any way?
So, I mean, listeners to our show will know that I'm a debt dove, and I try to defuse anxiety about debt, especially debt issued by the US government, which is the pinnacle of the global financial system. And I'm not suddenly going to turn into a debt hawk because there's a Trump administration, and I disapprove of almost everything they're going to do, using debt anxiety as a cudgel to beat the Trump administration with. It's a cheap move that you do see on the left, and it's our analog to the way in which the right shifts from a position of debt neurosis to a position of debt anxiety, depending on who's in office. So we're not going to make that move. So the crucial distinction we need to make in thinking about debt is the distinction between private debt and public debt, right? And public debt in a fiat money system like the one that we've all been living in for more than half a century, since the early 1970s, will always be paid back. Why? Because it's denominated in dollars, and there is no limit on the ability of the monetary authorities to print and issue dollars for the repayment of debt. First and foremost, that's what they're for, arguably, other than prudence, right? So that's the only constraint. In a legal technical sense, these debts will always be paid. You don't want to do that by, printing a giant lottery winner's check that says, $27 trillion or whatever, and handing that out, because it would destabilize the faith and credit and the stability of the entire financial system. But on the other hand, neither do you want to fully repay the debt. The very idea of asking the question, could the federal government debt be repaid, should be anathema to any sensible person. Why? Because public debt is fundamentally unlike private debt with regard to the question of what repaying it would mean. It's not just that it can always be repaid, because unlike a private debt, the state is in fact the issuer of the currency in which it's repaid. But it's also the function of debt in a public context. Like if you or I borrow money, Cam, from a bank, right? It's an individual act. And if we were a business, if Foreign Policy or Ones and Twos podcast went out to raise, capital for a project, it would be an obligation to a particular lender, and it would be for a specific project. And obviously the lender wants to know that we can repay our obligation to them in good time and on the terms that we agree. And we need that project to pay off. And all of this has got to happen within our lifetimes, right? That's the ultimate constraint on this. This show doesn't continue when one of us, passes on. So that's the fundamental constraint on what we do. But states don't have finite lifetimes. So each individual obligation, say we're talking about $5 billion worth of 10-year debt issued by the Treasury in early 2025, and there will be huge tranches like this being issued, has to be paid back and will be paid back without fail to the letter on the dot, barring some Doge Musk, shenanigans and nonsense with the payment system. Like that was what people were worried about, that they would mess with that system and somehow inconceivably the specific obligation to repay particular debt on a particular time would not be met. But if you ask how in 2035, 10 years from now, we're going to repay that 10-year treasury, the most obvious answer is we're going to issue a new 10-year treasury in 2035 for $5 billion or whatever it is we need to repay. And you could say, well, hang on, that means we're continuously kicking the can forward. But yes, that is exactly what we're going to do. Why? Because in the same way as the American government now has an unlimited time horizon in relation to the 10-year debt it issues now, it still has an unlimited time horizon in relation to the 10-year debt it issues in 2035, because we don't get closer to infinity in 10 years' time, right? There's still this infinite time horizon. Furthermore, what we know pretty much for sure is that there will be some measure, perhaps not the identical level of measure, but nevertheless some measure of demand for that debt when we issue it. Why? Because what public debt serves as is not a particular gamble by a particular business on the creditworthiness of ones and twos, but essentially as the dumping ground for our collective savings. And there are people now who want to save for 10 years and put it in a very safe asset that pays interest and then will repay them in 10 years' time, which is where the demand for the 10-year, $5 billion issuance right now comes from. And we know for certain, as long as the American economy goes on and there are savers, in 10 years' time, there will be people who also want to make that deal. The question is, will they want to make that deal on the same terms as right now? And that's the question. And assuming that we don't engage in ridiculously imprudent behavior, and the Trump administration and the Republicans are, after all, just doing Republican tax and spend, or rather just spend and don't tax policy like they've done repeatedly since the Reagan era. That's all they're doing. The American economy, American capitalism has lived with this for almost half a century. That's what they're going to engage in. And so, yes, we do expect the American economy to still be there in 10 years' time. We do expect investors to be there. And they will soak up and absorb this debt. And the Congressional Budget Office forecasts are that as a result of these actions, the debt level will rise from 100% of GDP for debt held in the private sector to 120% of GDP for debt held in the private sector. And that's a manageable number. And so we will expect people to be coming back. And that's the way this will be rolled forward, we all hope, for eternity. Because if we were to take this public debt offering away, folks that wanted to save money safely for 10 years would have to stick it in private debt. In other words, they'd have to make loans to ones and twos or some other private undertaking like that. And even if Nvidia or Apple are brilliant companies, and they can borrow on terms which are very little different from the American government, they are, after all, still gambles on the fact that iPhones will be attractive in 10 years' time, or the particular brand of AI chips that Nvidia produces will be world-beating. Whereas you could just invest your money in the prospect that there will be an American state, American government, and a GDP, which even the GOP at some level will be willing to tax in some form. And so obviously, the latter, the government debt mechanism, is a much safer collective way of handling the intergenerational transfer or the intertemporal transfer of wealth that's necessary for everyone to engage in long-range planning for their retirement and so on. And so that's what public sector debt does. And really the question is how a society copes if its debt to GDP level is too low. There may be an upper limit. We haven't found it. Japan is at the very, very high side, but war economies have often managed with debt to GDP levels around 200% or so on. That is a big burden to keep churning. But if you go much below the German level, you end up in a situation where there's such demand for public debt. So the German level is 60% of GDP, debt to GDP. If you go much beyond that level, you'll find that there's such demand for public debt that the prices are really high. And guess what then happens is interest rates go negative. And that obviously is rather tough for savers and people who have made plans to earn safe, positive returns over time. So the optimal level of debt is somewhere in between, and the United States is sort of bobbing around in that space.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, it is sort of remarkable or stark to say that the simple, like, persistence of the country is sufficient to maintain the demand for the debt. I mean, like, even if the country is not productive, say, I mean, or if it ceases to be productive, or even, I guess
But
there.
it's the contrast between the persistence of the country and the finitude of individual life that really creates the possibility here, right? Is that we all need to save for a finite time horizon, and that's why we need something that will pay back. And it's the infinite time horizon of the collective that enables us to do that. And insofar as our society goes on generating taxable income, that's something that we can manage, right? Because if what we in retirement need is groceries, somewhere to live, maintenance on the apartment that we live in, those kind of things, those are all largely domestically produced or considerably extent domestically produced. And so it's really just tokens on those things. If you can think about this as tokens on the basic consumption set, if you took the money veil out, that's what this would consist of.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about U.S. debt. So to shift to the U.S. case right now, as I mentioned, Trump has his tax priorities that the Congress is trying to work out. It seems like those various kinds of tax cuts could amount to costing some $10 trillion issued in debt on top of the debt we've already been talking about. And, I suppose given what we've just discussed, you could make the case that America can afford to make those tax cuts permanent. But I'm curious about, given Trump's dismantling of the U.S. administrative state that's been ongoing through Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, as it's called. I mean, do we even still have the data about U.S. debt that is accurate enough to make assessments about whether it's sustainable or whether, what exactly these debts cost the country?
I mean, the short answer is yes, we do. This is part of the MAGA bullshit that we have to continuously deal with right now. They're just going to go on saying nonsensical things which aren't true. Are we, broadly speaking, able to measure American public debt? Of course we are. Is it likely? I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. I don't know why we're even entertaining the idea that there's large scale fraud in the management of U.S. Treasury. It's absurd. This isn't Musk level. I mean, as dramatic as Musk's activities are, he's dwarfed by the U.S. Treasury market. Right? The U.S. Treasury market is all the serious people in the world, and the idea that there's large scale fraud there is just silly. I mean, we shouldn't be entertaining it. So the answer is yes, we definitely do have a way of assessing this. A. B, to go back to the earlier point, just because the tax policy we're talking is grotesque, we shouldn't engage the logic of austerians and affordability. Of course, we can afford it, yeah? But the question is, what would it do to do this? And again, it's worth saying, are the data able to tell us what would happen if we implement the Trump tax cut and the proposed budget policy of the US House of Representatives? The answer is absolutely yes, and it's crystal clear. And what it's telling us is that this is a spectacularly inegalitarian tax policy with very little so far demonstrated benefit for the growth of the US economy, but huge and obvious benefits for the top 5% and particularly for the top 1%, and even more then for the people earning like $3 million plus, which I believe is the 0.1% of the American distribution. So and we can spell this out, and we should spell it out, because there's no opacity about this. There's no vagueness about this. Half of the benefits of this proposed rollover of the 2017 tax cut would go to the top 5% of the income distribution in the US. That's households, just to put this in perspective, declaring income for taxation purposes of more than $320,000. Of that half, 30% of the benefit would go to those in the top 1%, and that's households declaring $720,000. And then within that, it's an even bigger benefit for the 0.1%, the people earning over $3 million who are in that exclusive faction. And so this is a $3.6 trillion giveaway at the expense of the federal government budget to the benefit of that upper 5%, that upper 1%, that upper 0.1% of the American income distribution. Cynically, straight ahead, up front, right there. And there's no arguing about it at all. There's no lack of transparency. There's no fudging. There's no getting away from this. And the extraordinary thing is you can still promote this as national economic policy in the United States, added to which the House of Representatives has gone even further. So there's the $3.6 trillion rollover of the Trump tax cut from 2017. They don't think that's big enough. They think there needs to be a $4.6 to $4.7 trillion giveaway. And the whole thing, add insult to injury, is going to be financed by a $2 trillion cut to benefits packages, which go largely to the incomes and households of the lowest income Americans, including food stamp recipients. Right? So that's the trade-off. When we ask, can America afford this, right? The standard macro answer should be, yeah, it's just a question of your priorities, right? And what you're basically saying with this measure is we utterly, clearly, straight ahead, in your face, prioritize huge giveaways for the highest earning Americans, which we will partially finance, about slightly more than half, 60% will be financed by new debt, and $2 trillion worth will be financed by cuts to the people who can least afford to suffer those cuts. And, provided that you're willing to buy that prioritization, this is as affordable as any other act of deficit finance government spending. It's just, the question has got to be whether American society can afford this kind of governance and what impact it's likely to have on millions of people, tens of millions of people once you counter in the households and everything else. I mean, it's a recipe for impoverishing those at the bottom and increasing the already extraordinary benefits and advantages enjoyed by the best off in American society.
I'm curious then about how geopolitics could affect this conversation about debt markets and U.S. debt. I mean, obviously the Trump administration is not shying away from destabilizing its relationships with other countries around the world. And, I'm wondering whether somewhere down the line, the holders of U.S. debt would have to, factor in the possibility that the United States might choose not to acknowledge the debts held by countries, say, like China, for political reasons. I mean, I'm imagining some hypothetical scenario where, the United States is maybe facing some economic constraints at home. Maybe inflation is rampant, and then, and tensions have been rising with China simultaneously. And then there's an announcement to essentially default on the debts that China's holding. Do other countries have to keep that possibility in mind, given all that's going on? I mean, do financial obligations like debt and the holding of debt, do they have a history of becoming instruments of politics in that way?
I mean, that scenario that you're outlining is really a novel one in the conversation about US public debt. I mean, it's a logical possibility. I think it's a selective default on your foreign creditors. It's the sort of thing that governments only normally consider doing under truly desperate circumstances, or if you're actually imposing sanctions on somebody. So to some extent, the freezing of Russian assets in the bank accounts of the European financial system is that, right? Because every Russian deposit is effectively a Russian claim. And so when you sanction those and prevent the Russians from pulling the money out, you're effectively voiding a debt obligation that you have to them. So that's the circumstances under which you might be able to do this. The consequences for your creditworthiness longer term are disastrous, right? No one will subsequently lend to you. So the much more common speculation is the other way around. The much more common speculation, which has become, which was a commonplace of the early 2000s as China's holdings against the United States began to build up, was that you'd have a sudden stop by the creditors to the borrower. In other words, the Chinese would stop lending new money to the Americans and might attempt to offload their existing claims, because there's always a market for US treasuries, and crash the US treasury market. And Russia, we believe the Kremlin actually recommended this to Beijing in early 2008. And again, to kind of throw cold water on an overdramatic scenario, Beijing took one look at this and said, no, that's crazy. We won't do that. Instead, they stayed in very close touch with the Americans. It's not just that there's this Treasury Advisory Committee, but there's also, government-to-government contact on these kind of issues. And they negotiated a shift of the Chinese holdings of government or quasi-government debt out of the most exposed parts of the US financial system that were most exposed to the mortgage crisis and into the safer part. And that's as far as Chinese measures went. There's another, however, politics to this, which speaks to your, the underlying gist of your question, which is that having done that, the Chinese public woke up and said, what the hell are we doing? Like, why are we lending money to the Americans? This doesn't make any sense. Hey, why are we subsidizing their threatening behavior towards us, and their efforts to resist the rise of China? So patriotic, not to say trolley opinion in China, said, we should stop doing this. So one of the things we've seen in China, and one of the reasons why China's declared figures for public debt owning in the US have fallen, is that it doesn't look very good for the Chinese official agencies to be accumulating more claims on the US. What we think's happened is that they shifted those claims to other bits of the Chinese financial system. So the claims are not being held by SAFE, the Foreign Asset Management Agency, but being held on the accounts of Chinese policy banks, for instance. And so then you might ask yourself, well, hang on. So you're telling me that they are going on accumulating claims on the United States despite the fact that they couldn't use them as a tool of power against America in 2008, like Russia recommended, and they're bad politics in China now because the Chinese public doesn't like to see Chinese support for America in this form? And the answer is, of course, that these claims against America, a little bit like the argument about the difference between public and private debt, are not, just freestanding financial obligations. They're the flip side of the underlying pattern of trade. And so long as China has a state-managed balance of payments and a large trade surplus with the United States, it's going to accumulate claims against America. That's what the trade surplus means. I give you, great Chinese stuff, and you give me claims. You give me promises to pay at some point in the future. And you don't just hold those as IOUs. The main IOU you hold is US Treasuries. That's why you have to pile them up. So as long as China, as long as Germany, as long as anyone goes on running a trade surplus with the United States, they in one form or another have to accumulate net financial claims against the US. And so long as whoever, the foreign reserve holders of all types, the Chinese, are not willing to adjust their economic policies to reduce that imbalance, the reserve accumulation goes on, and your only option is really to hide it in various forms. And maybe in this case, the Trump administration is going to help because, of course, they're imposing tariffs and their professed aim is to reduce America's imports. What it's not entirely clear that they understand is that that would actually hurt, because imports are not a means by which the rest of the world rips America off and then acquires a claim on it for finance as well. Imports are actually the opposite. They're an exchange in which America takes great good stuff from the rest of the world in exchange for financial obligations. And so if you stop that flow, yes, the foreigners no longer acquire financial claims on you, but also American consumers have to do without all of the good foreign stuff that came previously from abroad at attractive prices. And that's what Trump appears to have hinted at his speech to Congress, but we're only going to see in the coming months whether they actually understand what that means. In other words, the American standard of living is going to go down as a result of this readjustment that they appear determined to carry out.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to finish off this conversation, I wonder if we can, maybe even indulge these hypotheticals a bit further. I mean, some kind of debt crisis, at least it's theoretically a possibility, accidentally triggered or not, at least it's conceivable. And I'm curious, what would that look like if America, as the, biggest, largest, economy in the world, if it really went through a real debt crisis, what would that look like in terms of the triggers and the effects of that? And would it be analogous to the other kinds of debt crises that we've seen from other countries in the recent past?
So this is not a hypothetical. It happened. It happened on our watch, Cam. Like you and I both watched it. I wrote for Foreign Policy about it, as did the other people. It happened in 2020. I mean, it happened in COVID in the spring of 2020. In February and March 2020, we saw a run on the Treasury market. We saw a sell out of the Treasury market. And it's an ongoing discussion exactly what triggered it. But the two key players were foreign reserve holders that needed, because their economies were shocked by COVID, like the American economy, to get at dollars quickly. Everyone wanted cash. And so they smashed their piggy banks in the US and tried to sell their treasuries. And that then either triggered or was helped to be precipitated by an unwinding of a bunch of hedge fund trades. And so you got that toxic interaction between normally placid, slow moving reserve holders and highly price sensitive hedge fund holders of treasuries. And we saw epic movements in treasuries. I'll never forget talking to like a financial manager from Singapore who described to me the shock of spending a day in Singapore trying to unload a portfolio of a couple of $1 billion of US treasuries, which are normally just like having a bank account. They're the same as dollars. You can sell them in a matter of seconds for $2 billion. And not being able to unload them all day long. And he described coming down out of the skyscraper he was in as looking up at the building and going, well, if my treasuries don't have a price today, what is that building worth? If I can't sell that treasury, like it is supposed to be the same as dollars, what is this building worth? And then looking around at the rest of Singapore and going, I don't know what any of this is worth if a US treasury is not the same as a dollar. That's how fundamental this was. And this is how shocking this was, which is why I ended up writing that book, Shutdown, about it, because it's a financial shock bigger than the 2008 banking crisis, because that was about private claims. That was about private mortgages, private securities. What we saw in the spring of 2020 was a crisis in the public debt market of the United States. But because it was in the public debt market of the United States, there was also an immediate and quick fix. So quick, so immediate that most people don't even know this happened, which is that, as we were saying at the top, public debt, private estate debt is not the same as other types of debt. It is the same as the currency. It's just another form. It's a less liquid form of the kind of liabilities issued by the government. And so how do you fix this? The Fed steps in. The Fed just simply started buying these. And it started answering the dude in Singapore's question, what is the treasury worth? The Fed said it's worth exactly what it says on the tin. If that says $100, here's $100. They bought on a single and several days, for several weeks, they were buying over $85 billion worth of US treasuries a day. Right? That is like 2008 quantitative easing of 30x. Like, because that's the kind of numbers that Bernanke was buying per month in 2008. They were doing it every single day. They bought a huge slice of the treasury market, just took it out of private hands and said, you know what? It's worth exactly what it says on the thing. Don't look down. This is not a Wile E. Coyote movement. We are not out over the precipice. You're firmly on land here. You just put your feet down, you'll discover it's worth exactly what we told you what it was worth. And that's how you end a crisis in the US debt market. Right? So we know how that works. Now, what we haven't experienced so far is a comprehensive run by American holders of debt on the American debt market. So what we saw was this interaction between the people in the Cayman Islands and the reserve holders abroad. It didn't spread to the entire foundations of the US financial system because the Fed didn't let it. Like if that guy in Singapore was having that thought, what you really don't want is the people in New Jersey having that thought. So that is what the Fed stepped in to stabilize and prevent from happening. And I don't think, I've been looking around prompted by your questions, but this is everyone's question. Like, could there be rumblings in the treasury market loud enough to actually sort of shake sense into the Trump administration? Is there a big liberal, hammer going to come down on the Trump administration and say, enough with the crazy? Right? Is there going to be a financial market voice that will say, well, you can do these sorts of things, but not those, and kind of constrain this? A little bit like the kind of threat potential that curbed the Clinton administration in the early 1990s or left-wing governments around the world have faced. They are much more vulnerable because their currencies aren't the dollar and their central banks aren't the Fed. The test of the Trump administration is what happens if this shaking happens at the very heart of the system. And there really isn't anything to suggest, so far at least, that we're going to see that kind of crunch. What we are seeing is an uncomfortably high level of interest rates, right? So when Trump was in office the first time round, when they did the tax cuts the first time round, the interest rate was 2%, 2.3% on 10-year treasuries. And now it's closer to 4.3%. And that's the difference that they may be faced with. And the worst case is that could edge up. It could go over 5. All of a sudden, then everything in the private sector would be more expensive in terms of credit costs, and the US Treasury would face much bigger interest rate bills. That would be the way I think we would imagine a pressure being exercised, a flat-out debt crisis in the US, a public debt crisis, a treasury market crisis. it's too horrible to even contemplate happening, and we already know what the fix would be. We just go straight to massive Fed intervention. And that's not something that's going to happen, I think, in that sense. And so then the issue will be, how much pressure, this is the fault line between the Fed and the Trump administration we're going to have to watch in coming years. How far can the Fed go in tweaking the tail of the tiger that is the Treasury market? And will the Trump administration cry foul and say, you establishment liberals, you deep state people in the Fed are actually it's not a full-on crisis, but you're raising the pressure. This is a strategy of tension that you're pursuing against us so as to curb what we want to do, which is why people like Vance actually are really quite aggressive towards the Fed. They would like to bring the Fed much more tightly under the control of the executive branch because they're afraid of this check and balance type logic.
Yeah, it does make me wonder if we're heading towards an era of stagflation, some stagnation in the economy, but also inflation, high interest rates, and still inflation, whether because of the tariffs, et cetera, and this leading to some kind of showdown with the Fed.
Great theme for the months to come, I think, as the American business cycle unfolds. This is very different from the last time round, and the Trump people are I don't know how long it's going to take before the penny drops, that they do not have the leeway that they did the last time round. The growth rate in the US is very unlikely to accelerate the way it marginally did in the first Trump administration. Everything points rather to a slowdown.
We shall see. We'll add it to the list of topics we want to address, but for now, we will get going. As always, we'll be back next week with some new topics. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.